You probably didn't notice the moment it happened. It wasn't a riot, it wasn't an angry mob. It was something much quieter. Maybe it happened during a meeting, maybe at a family dinner, maybe in a group chat. Someone mentioned a person's name. One person rolled their eyes, another laughed. Someone added a story. Within seconds, everyone seemed to agree. Yeah, they're the problem. And something strange happened. The room felt lighter. People smiled. Conversation became easier. It almost felt good, as if speaking badly about that one person had somehow brought everyone closer together. Have you ever wondered why? Why every group seems to have that one person? The difficult coworker, the black sheep of the family. The student everyone secretly blames, the politician everyone loves to hate, the outsider, the scapegoat. We tell ourselves they're simply getting what they deserve. But Carl Jung believed something far more unsettling. Sometimes a group doesn't unite because it has found the guilty person. Sometimes it unites because it has found someone willing or vulnerable enough to carry everything the group refuses to see in itself. And once you recognize that pattern, you begin seeing it everywhere. By the end of this journey, you'll never look at public outrage, office politics, family conflict, or even your own moments of certainty the same way again. Because what looks like justice from the outside may actually be psychology. Think about the last group you belonged to, your workplace, your family, your circle of friends, your political side. Every group tells a story about itself. We're honest. We're hardworking. We're the reasonable ones. We're the good people. That story feels comforting. It gives people a shared identity, a reason to belong. But every story leaves something out. Every group quietly decides what doesn't belong. Not only certain people, certain qualities, weakness, cowardice, selfishness, envy, neediness, ambition, anger. Whatever threatens the image the group wants to believe about itself slowly gets pushed out of sight. Not destroyed, just hidden. Jung had a name for this hidden territory. He called it the shadow. When most people hear that word, they imagine something dark, cruelty, violence, hatred. But Jung meant something much broader. The shadow isn't simply the worst part of you. It's every part of you that you've learned to reject. Sometimes that includes anger, sometimes confidence, sometimes vulnerability, sometimes the ability to say no, sometimes the courage to disappoint other people. Anything your mind quietly decided, someone like me isn't allowed to be this, doesn't disappear. It simply moves out of sight. Imagine living in a beautiful old house. Whenever something embarrassing appears, an unpaid bill, an old mistake, a broken piece of furniture, you don't throw it away. You carry it downstairs, into the basement. Year after year, everything unwanted ends up there. Eventually, the house upstairs still looks perfect. Guests admire it. Everything appears clean, orderly, respectable. But underneath, the basement keeps filling. The floorboards begin to bend. The walls begin to shift. The foundation slowly weakens. Nothing was ever solved. It was only hidden. Jung believed the human mind works much the same way. So do families, so do companies, so do nations, so do entire civilizations. Now think about something you've probably seen before. There's always one colleague nobody wants to work with, not necessarily because they're incompetent, but because everyone seems strangely comfortable making them the butt of every joke. Every delay somehow becomes their fault. Every awkward silence somehow circles back to them. Over time, something peculiar happens. Nobody even remembers how it started. They only remember that everyone agrees. And agreement itself begins to feel like evidence. But agreement isn't evidence. Sometimes, it's simply relief. Because once everyone agrees where the problem lives, no one has to ask whether a small part of that problem lives inside themselves. That is the beginning of what Jung believed was one of the most powerful psychological forces in human life. Not individual shadow, collective shadow. Here's the unsettling part. Groups don't create collective shadows because they're evil. They create them because they're human. Looking inward is painful. Looking outward is easy. Blaming someone else is emotionally cheaper than questioning ourselves. So without ever planning it, without anyone voting, Without anyone even noticing, groups begin assigning unwanted qualities to someone else. One person becomes lazy, another becomes selfish, another becomes dangerous, another becomes unstable. The group slowly hands them everything it doesn't want to carry. The frightening part is that everyone involved sincerely believes they're simply describing reality. They aren't lying. They're projecting. And projection doesn't feel like imagination. It feels exactly like certainty. The next time you're in a room where everyone agrees about who the problem is, pause. Just for a moment. Before asking, "What's wrong with them?" ask something much more uncomfortable. Why does agreeing about them make all of us feel so much closer? Because that single question opens the door to one of Carl Jung's deepest and most disturbing discoveries. And that's exactly where we're going next. Imagine walking into work on a Monday morning. Nothing unusual has happened. No announcement, no argument, no dramatic confrontation. And yet, something has changed. People stop talking when one colleague walks past. Their name comes up more often than before. Every mistake somehow finds its way back to them. Someone jokes that they're always like this. Everyone laughs, including people who barely know them. Nobody planned it, nobody organized it, but somehow everyone understands the role this person now plays. How does that happen? How can dozens of ordinary people slowly begin seeing one human being through exactly the same lens? Carl Jung believed the answer wasn't found in the person being judged. It was found in the people doing the judging. One of Jung's most unsettling observations was this: everything that is unconscious in ourselves, we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. Read that again. He's saying something astonishing. The qualities we struggle hardest to see in ourselves often become impossible to ignore in someone else, not because they possess those qualities more than anyone else, but because our own minds are quietly looking for somewhere else to place them. This is what Jung called projection. And despite the name, it isn't something we choose. It's something that happens before we're even aware of it. That's why it feels so convincing. When you project, it doesn't feel like imagination. It feels like observation. Think about the last person who instantly irritated you, not someone who genuinely harmed you, someone who simply got under your skin. Maybe they seemed arrogant, too loud, too needy, too emotional, too confident, too ambitious. Now, ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why them? Out of all the people you've met, why did that particular quality provoke such a strong reaction? Jung would suggest something that feels almost offensive at first. Perhaps what disturbed you wasn't the quality itself. Perhaps it was your relationship to that quality inside yourself. Maybe the confidence you hated was the confidence you were taught never to show. Maybe the selfishness you condemned was the ability to protect yourself that you never allowed yourself to develop. Maybe the anger you judged was your own anger, buried so deeply that seeing someone else express it felt almost unbearable. Projection doesn't always point toward evil. Sometimes it points toward an unlived life. That is why shadow work is so difficult. Your shadow doesn't contain only your darkness, it often contains your potential. Think back to childhood. Almost everyone heard sentences like these. Good children, don't get angry. Stop showing off. Don't be so sensitive. Be strong. Don't cry. Don't be selfish. Little by little, we begin editing ourselves. Some parts are welcomed, others are quietly locked away. Not because they're bad, but because love, acceptance, or belonging seem to depend on hiding them. Years later, those rejected parts haven't disappeared. They've simply changed addresses. Instead of living consciously inside us, they begin appearing in other people. Now imagine this process happening, not inside one child, but inside an entire community. Every member learns the same unwritten rules. People like us don't behave that way. We aren't weak. We don't complain. We don't fail. We aren't greedy. The story grows stronger with every generation, and so does the shadow. Because every quality the group refuses to own, has to go somewhere. Eventually, someone begins carrying it. This is where something extraordinary happens. The group starts feeling morally united, not because everyone suddenly became better people, because everyone now agrees where the darkness lives, out there, never in here. It's an emotional shortcut, and shortcuts are seductive. Think about social media for a moment. One video goes viral, one mistake gets exposed, thousands of strangers arrive. Most of them know almost nothing about the person, yet within hours, complete certainty appears. Everyone agrees. Everyone repeats the same words. Everyone feels strangely connected to people they've never met. Why? Because shared outrage creates instant belonging. For a brief moment, having a common enemy feels almost identical to having a common purpose. That's why outrage spreads so easily. It doesn't just attack someone, it rewards everyone participating. Now, notice something fascinating. The more people agree, the less anyone questions themselves. It's as though responsibility dissolves into the crowd. The individual conscience becomes quieter. The group becomes louder. Jung observed something remarkably close to this when he described how people can unconsciously lose themselves inside a collective identity. Alone, you might hesitate. Inside a crowd, hesitation feels like betrayal. The group begins thinking for you, feeling for you, judging for you. And perhaps the most dangerous part is that it feels completely natural. Imagine holding a compass in. When you're standing alone in an open field, the needle points north. You trust it. Now imagine placing a powerful magnet beside it. The needle swings instantly. Bring another compass close. It swings the same way, then another and another. Soon, every compass points in exactly the same direction. If you didn't know the magnet was there, you'd probably think unanimous agreement proved the direction was correct. But it doesn't. It proves every compass is responding to the same invisible force. Groups often behave the same way. The more unanimous the certainty becomes, the more careful you should be. Because agreement and truth are not the same thing. So the next time everyone around you seems absolutely certain about who deserves blame, don't begin by examining the accused. Begin by examining the certainty itself. Ask yourself, what invisible magnet could be pulling all of us in exactly the same direction? Because once you ask that question, you're already beginning to step outside the collective mind, and that's precisely what the collective fears most. Because what happens when even one person refuses to project? That question leads us to one of the oldest psychological rituals humanity has ever invented, one that appeared thousands of years before Carl Jung, yet reveals exactly the same truth: the scapegoat. Think back to every school you've ever attended. Every class seemed to have one student, not necessarily the weakest, not always the loudest, but somehow the one everyone laughed at. If something disappeared, people looked at them. If something went wrong, their name came up first. Even teachers sometimes treated them differently. The strange thing was, after a while, nobody questioned it anymore. It simply became the way things were. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The longer it continued, the more normal it felt. Maybe you've seen the same thing happen inside a family. One child becomes the difficult one, another becomes the successful one. One is expected to solve everyone's problems, another is blamed for creating them. Years pass, the roles harden. Eventually, people stop seeing individuals. They only see the role. And once someone becomes the role, every new event seems to confirm it. This is one of the oldest psychological patterns humanity has ever repeated. Long before psychology gave it a name, people were already living it. Thousands of years ago, an extraordinary ritual took place. Once every year, the community gathered. The priest placed both hands upon a living goat. Then, something remarkable happened. Instead of sacrificing the people, their failures, their guilt, their violence, their hidden darkness were symbolically placed onto the animal. The goat was then driven into the wilderness. The people watched it disappear, and afterwards, they felt clean. Not because they're Darkness had disappeared because it now lived somewhere else. That ritual appears in the book of Leviticus. For centuries, it seemed like ancient religion. Carl Jung saw something deeper. It revealed a timeless psychological truth. Human beings have always searched for someone else to carry what they cannot bear to carry themselves. Centuries later, another thinker noticed exactly the same pattern. The French philosopher René Girard spent decades studying myths, religions, history, and violence. Again and again, he found the same story. Communities under pressure slowly become divided. Conflict grows, fear spreads, people begin turning against one another, until suddenly, almost everyone agrees on one thing. One person is responsible, one person becomes the problem, one person must go. The remarkable part is what happens next. For a little while, peace returns. The arguments stop. The community feels united again. Everyone believes justice has been done. But Girard realized something astonishing. The peace wasn't created because the scapegoat was guilty. It was created because everyone finally shared the same target. That unity felt like healing, but it wasn't healing. It was relief. And relief can easily disguise itself as truth. Look around today. You don't have to search very hard. It happens online every week. A celebrity says something foolish. A politician makes a mistake. Someone posts an old comment. Within hours, millions of strangers agree. They deserve to be destroyed. Some deserve criticism, absolutely. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something different. The strange emotional pleasure that appears when thousands of people attack together. Notice how quickly nuance disappears, how quickly complexity dies, how quickly one human being becomes nothing more than a symbol. That's the moment psychology quietly replaces justice. Here's something that fascinated Jung. The scapegoat isn't usually hated because they possess one obvious flaw. They're hated because they accidentally carry qualities the group has rejected inside itself. Think about that for a moment. The group that condemns arrogance may secretly envy confidence. The group obsessed with loyalty may secretly fear its own betrayal. The group shouting loudest about corruption may have spent years refusing to examine its own compromises. The louder the accusation, the more interesting the psychology becomes, because hatred often reveals far more about the people expressing it than the person receiving it. But here's the part that surprised even me when I first encountered Jung. The shadow doesn't exile only what is ugly. Sometimes, it exiles what is beautiful. Think about the child who loved drawing until classmates mocked them. The teenager who stopped asking questions because everyone called them strange. The employee who stopped speaking honestly because honesty became dangerous. The woman who learned to hide her ambition. The man who learned to hide his vulnerability. None of these qualities disappeared. They simply went underground. Sometimes the things we reject aren't our worst qualities. They're our unlived gifts. That's why the scapegoat often carries something precious, not because they're perfect, far from it, but because they're expressing something everyone else has quietly buried. The artist reminds people of the creativity they abandoned. The rebel reminds them of the courage they surrendered. The outsider reminds them of the freedom they traded for acceptance. Without realizing it, the group begins attacking not only its fear, but also its forgotten potential. And every time it succeeds, it becomes a little safer, a little more predictable, a little less alive. Think about that. What happens to a family that always silences honesty? What happens to a company that always punishes creativity? What happens to a nation that always fears disagreement? At first, everything feels stable, peaceful, orderly. But underneath, something essential has disappeared. Because every time a community destroys the person carrying its rejected qualities, it destroys the possibility of recovering those qualities itself. That is why the relief never lasts. Soon, another scapegoat becomes necessary, then another, then another. The hunger returns. Because projection can never permanently satisfy a problem it refuses to solve. Now, imagine something almost impossible. Imagine a group that refuses to choose a scapegoat. Imagine a family where someone finally says, maybe this isn't only about him. Imagine a workplace where one person asks, why do we always end up blaming the same colleague? Imagine a nation willing to ask, what part of this problem belongs to us? The atmosphere changes instantly, not because conflict disappears, because responsibility has finally entered the room, and responsibility is something the shadow has always feared. But this raises perhaps the most difficult question Carl Jung ever asked. If the shadow belongs to all of us, how do we stop projecting it? How do we actually reclaim it without becoming consumed by it? Because understanding the mechanism is only the beginning. Living differently is something else entirely. And that's where our journey turns inward. There's something deeply comforting about believing the problem is always somewhere else. Someone else's anger, someone else's arrogance, someone else's selfishness, someone else's blindness. As long as the darkness belongs to someone else, you never have to look for it in yourself. And for a while, that feels like peace. But it's a fragile peace, because it depends on someone else carrying what you've refused to carry. Imagine a city that refuses to build drains. Every year the rain comes, every year the streets flood, cars stall, homes are damaged, people complain. The city blames the weather again and again and again, until eventually someone asks a painfully obvious question. What if the problem isn't the rain? The rain was never the enemy. The city simply built nowhere for the water to go. Jung believed the human mind works in much the same way. Your emotions don't become dangerous because they exist. They become dangerous because you've given them nowhere to exist consciously. When anger has nowhere to go, it becomes resentment. When grief has nowhere to go, it becomes bitterness. When fear has nowhere to go, it becomes hatred. The problem isn't the emotion. The problem is the refusal to acknowledge it. Most people imagine shadow work as becoming a kinder person. Jung didn't. In fact, he thought the opposite misunderstanding was one of the greatest obstacles to psychological growth. People imagine integrating the shadow means eliminating darkness. It doesn't. It means finally admitting the darkness was always there. That sounds frightening, until you realize something important. The things we refuse to acknowledge don't disappear. They simply begin making decisions without asking our permission. Think about driving a car. Which is more dangerous? Knowing your brakes sometimes fail, or believing they're perfect when they aren't? Most people would choose the first, because once you know, you can compensate, you stay alert, you drive differently. Awareness changes behavior, denial doesn't. Jung believed the same principle applies to character. The person who knows they're capable of cruelty is often less dangerous than the person convinced they never could be. The person certain they're incapable of manipulation is often the easiest for manipulation to hide inside. Awareness doesn't create darkness, it puts a name on it. And once something has a name, it becomes much harder for it to control you from the shadows. There's a sentence Jung wrote that has haunted people for decades. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Most people hear that and imagine self-love. That's not what Jung meant. He meant accepting everything, the generosity and the jealousy, the compassion and the resentment, the courage and the cowardice, the parts you're proud to introduce, and the parts you'd rather nobody ever discovered. Wholeness isn't built by choosing one over the other. It's built by refusing to lie about either. Now think back to someone who once made you irrationally angry. Not someone abusive, not someone who truly harmed you, someone who simply got under your skin. Maybe they interrupted people. Maybe they loved attention. Maybe they never apologized. Maybe they seemed painfully confident. Now, pause. Don't answer immediately. Ask yourself something you've probably never asked before. Why did that particular quality affect me so much? Not, was it wrong? But, why did it hook me? Sometimes the answer really is simple. They behaved badly. But sometimes Your emotional reaction tells a second story. One about yourself. Maybe their confidence reminded you of confidence you never allowed yourself to have. Maybe their refusal to please everyone exposed how exhausted you've become trying to please everyone. Maybe their selfishness wasn't admirable, but maybe it revealed that you've spent your whole life believing your own needs don't matter. The shadow speaks quietly. It rarely says, "Become this person." Instead, it whispers, "Why does this person affect you so deeply?" That question changes everything. Because now you're no longer studying someone else, you're studying yourself. The strange thing about awareness is that it rarely feels dramatic. Movies teach us that transformation arrives with a breakthrough. Real life is quieter. It happens in moments like these. Someone in the room begins criticizing another person. Normally, you'd join in. This time, you don't. You notice your impulse. You stay silent. Not because the other person is innocent, but because you're curious. Why did I want to join so quickly? That tiny pause is where psychological freedom begins. Not certainty, curiosity. Most people believe maturity means becoming better than they once were. Jung might have said something different. Maturity is becoming less surprised by yourself. You stop pretending you're incapable of envy, or pride, or pettiness, or fear. You stop performing innocence. And strangely, that's the moment genuine compassion becomes possible. Because once you've met your own darkness, other people's darkness becomes easier to understand without immediately excusing it. You can hold both truths at once. What they did was wrong. And I recognize the human capacity that made it possible. That balance is extraordinarily difficult. But without it, every conflict becomes a battle between heroes and villains. Reality is rarely that simple. So the next time everyone agrees that one person is the problem, don't rush to defend them, and don't rush to condemn them either. Instead, watch your own mind. Notice how quickly certainty appears. Notice how satisfying agreement feels. Notice how comforting it is to believe the darkness lives entirely outside you. Then ask the question Carl Jung spent his life inviting people to ask. What part of this story also belongs to me? You may not like the answer, but that answer is the beginning of freedom. There's just one final piece of the puzzle. Because if groups project and individuals project, why do certain people become the ones who carry those projections over and over again? Why does the same child become the family scapegoat? Why does the same colleague become the office outcast? Why do some people seem to attract the collective shadow wherever they go? The answer is more heartbreaking and more hopeful than anything we've explored so far. Because it isn't only the crowd that's unconscious. Sometimes the scapegoat is too. And once you understand why, you'll never see either side of the story the same way again. Let's return to where we began. A room, a family, a meeting, a classroom, a comment section. A single name is mentioned. Almost instantly, everyone agrees. They're the problem. At the beginning of this journey, that scene probably looked ordinary. Now, look again. Notice the faces. Notice how quickly certainty spreads. Notice how nobody feels uncertain anymore. Nobody asks another question. Nobody says, maybe we're missing something. Instead, the room becomes lighter, more united, almost peaceful. And that's exactly what makes collective projection so dangerous. It doesn't feel like hatred. It feels like harmony. We've spent this entire journey looking at the crowd. Now, let's look at the person standing in the middle. The one carrying everyone's blame. There's something about Jung's psychology that many people overlook. The projection doesn't always land randomly. It often finds someone who already carries an old wound, someone who has spent years believing, maybe I really am the problem. Think about the child who was always blamed, the sibling who learned to apologize before anyone even accused them, the employee who takes responsibility for mistakes they didn't make, the friend who always tries to keep the peace. Over time, Something invisible begins to happen. They stop resisting the role, not consciously, quietly, almost automatically. Without realizing it, they begin carrying emotional weight that was never theirs. Not because they're weak, because somewhere in their own story, they learned that belonging sometimes meant carrying other people's pain. This is where Jung's insight becomes almost heartbreaking. The crowd doesn't create the entire pattern. The wounded person doesn't create it either. Each completes something in the other. The crowd is searching for somewhere to place its shadow. The wounded person has spent years believing, perhaps I deserve to carry it. Neither side understands what's happening. Neither side wakes up intending cruelty. They're simply acting out a story neither of them knows they're inside. That is why these patterns can repeat for generations. In families, in workplaces, in friendships, in politics, even in entire nations. Until someone finally sees the story. But seeing the story changes something. Because once you recognize a pattern, it becomes much harder to keep living inside it. If you've spent your life becoming the scapegoat, perhaps the question is no longer, why do people always do this to me? Perhaps the deeper question is, why have I always believed I had to carry what wasn't mine? And if you've spent your life inside the crowd, perhaps your question becomes, why does blaming someone else make me feel so safe? Those are painful questions, but they're honest ones, and honest questions are where transformation begins. Imagine yourself in that room one last time. The same conversation begins, the same jokes, the same certainty, the same target. Only this time, you notice something you never noticed before. You notice how quickly everyone relaxes after deciding who the problem is. You notice how satisfying agreement feels. You notice the strange warmth that comes from standing with the majority. Then, instead of joining in, you become curious, not about the accused, about the crowd. You ask yourself, what are we protecting? What are we afraid to admit? What would happen if nobody here carried our shadow for us? The room suddenly feels different. Nothing outside has changed, but something inside you has. That tiny shift is where psychological freedom begins. Carl Jung believed the greatest danger wasn't that human beings possess darkness. Darkness has always been part of us. The real danger begins when we're absolutely certain that darkness belongs only to someone else. Because once we believe that, almost anything becomes justifiable. Cruelty begins to look like justice. Exclusion begins to look like morality. Hatred begins to feel like virtue. History has shown us this lesson again and again, not only in dictatorships or revolutions or wars, but in ordinary families, ordinary offices, ordinary friendships, and ordinary people. People very much like us. Perhaps that's why Jung believed becoming whole wasn't about becoming perfect. It was about becoming honest. Honest enough to admit, I am capable of kindness, but also, I am capable of cruelty. I can love. I can envy. I can forgive. I can destroy. Only the person who knows both can truly choose between them. The person who believes they're incapable of darkness has already surrendered the ability to recognize it. So the next time you find yourself in a room where everyone agrees, pause. Not because the accused is necessarily innocent, and not because the crowd is necessarily wrong. Pause because certainty spreads faster than truth. Pause because agreement is not always wisdom. Pause because every crowd believes it sees clearly, and almost none of them realize they're looking through the lens of their own shadow. Maybe the bravest person in the room isn't the loudest voice. It isn't the person being accused. It isn't even the person who turns out to be right. Maybe the bravest person is the one willing to interrupt the invisible agreement, the one who quietly asks, before we decide who they are, shouldn't we ask who we've become? That single question has the power to stop a family from creating another black sheep, to stop a workplace from choosing another outcast, to stop a society from needing another enemy, and perhaps to stop you from spending another year fighting parts of yourself that were never meant to be destroyed, only understood. Because in the end, the opposite of the shadow isn't light. The opposite of the shadow is awareness. and awareness is where freedom begins. If today's journey has made you see someone, or perhaps yourself, through different eyes, I'd love to hear what stayed with you the most. Not the theory, but the moment that made you stop and think. Share it in the comments, because sometimes the most important part of a conversation begins after the video ends. Thank you for watching.